should have been impossible. My father, a man with no medical background, described his own complex surgery with perfect accuracy, from a perspective outside his own body. That one moment forced me to question everything I was taught, both as a physicist and now in my medical training. It ignited a lifelong search for the true nature of consciousness. I'm Olympia, and welcome. Today, we're not just asking what is consciousness. We're exploring the scientific theories that dare to explain experiences just like that. My academic path has been anything but linear. It began in the world of pure logic and mathematical beauty during my doctoral work in quantum physics, where I delved into Darboux transformations for nonlinear von Neumann differential equations, abstract tools that describe the fundamental fabric of existence. At the same time, life is leading me down a different, more tangible path as I now pursue my doctorate in medicine. Here, instead of symbols and equations, I confront the biological complexity and fragility of the human body. It is precisely at this seemingly disparate junction, where the elegance of an equation meets the mystery of life, that my deepest questions arose, questions that continue to fuel my quest to this day. Intellectual curiosity, however, wasn't my only driver. My own spontaneous states of consciousness also spurred my inquiry. These were experiences so intense and lucid that I have spent over 20 years trying to understand them. In a state of complete sobriety, they unveiled reality in a completely new light, forcing me to reconfigure my entire worldview. After years of studying mystical and psychological texts, I identified them as profound Gnostic experiences, a direct insight or gnosis into the structure of reality. These two pillars, my father's testimony and my own inner experiences, transformed the question, what is consciousness? From a purely academic problem into the central focus of my intellectual and spiritual quest. It became a personal mission to understand something that eludes simple materialistic explanations. This synergy of personal experience and scientific rigor became the engine for my work. Groundbreaking scientific questions often arise not just from cold data analysis, but from deep, personal engagement, and from experiences that challenge the status quo. The history of science is filled with cases where intuition and personal insights played a key role, though they are often marginalized in standard scientific discourse. My profound experiences, combined with the tools from my background in physics and my ongoing medical studies, have allowed me to look at these phenomena from a new perspective, not dismissing them outright, but using them to give my research existential weight. It is this unique blend that drives my interdisciplinary approach, striving to integrate seemingly distant fields of knowledge. As for my faith, I intentionally don't discuss it in detail in my episodes. I am a person of deep faith. I believe in God, just not in the simplified version the Catholic Church presented to me throughout my life. My exploration of consciousness does not exclude the existence of the God I believe in. On the contrary, it reinforces it. That is why this episode, and the ones to follow, are so personal and important to me. They bring together everything that I hold most dear in life. So, let's begin. Our first step is to frame the central problem and articulate the objective for this episode. Neuroscience is currently dominated by the Neurocentric model, which posits consciousness as either an emergent property or an epiphenomenon of complex neural computation. Yet, while this paradigm has yielded crucial insights into the neural correlates of consciousness, NCCs, it proves fundamentally inadequate when confronted with what David Chalmers has termed the hard problem of consciousness, a topic I explored in the preceding episode. It leaves unanswered the central question: how do physical processes, regardless of their complexity, give rise to subjective experience, to phenomenal qualities, or qualia? This is not a mere promissory note for future neuroscience. The very persistence of the hard problem, in the face of decades of intensive research and technological advances in brain mapping, functions as a systemic critique of the paradigm itself. It suggests that the model's foundational assumptions regarding the nature of reality and the mind-matter relationship may be intrinsically flawed. Indeed, the explanatory limits of a purely reductionist approach become conspicuous when addressing transpersonal phenomena, near-death experiences, NDEs, and certain anomalous states of awareness, such as those that have informed my own inquiry. These limitations do not simply invite, but rather mandate an exploration of alternative theoretical frameworks. Accordingly, the purpose of this episode is to establish the theoretical groundwork that underpins my own working hypotheses that posit consciousness as an emergent structure arising not from the brain, but from a universal field of information. To be clear, a detailed exposition of my own models will be reserved for subsequent episodes. Our focus here is on constructing an interdisciplinary synthesis of existing theories that point toward a non-local, field-like conception of consciousness, one potentially integrated with a universal informational matrix. These concepts constitute the intellectual scaffolding upon which my own investigation is built. This brings me to my methodology, which I conceive of as the weaving of an interdisciplinary tapestry. Understanding a concept as profound and multifaceted as consciousness, especially one that may transcend the confines of the individual brain, demands such an approach. Throughout this inquiry, I will draw insights and arguments from quantum physics, cosmology, depth psychology, with particular emphasis on the thought of Carl Gustav Jung, transpersonal psychology, the philosophy of mind, and select mystical traditions. Each of these domains offers a unique lens through which to view the nature of consciousness and its potential interconnectedness with the fundamental fabric of reality. The necessity of this approach is not merely a methodological choice. It reflects a core ontological assumption. If consciousness is indeed a fundamental and non-local aspect of the universe, then its traces and operations must inevitably manifest across various domains of that reality, and consequently, across various domains of human inquiry. The convergence of themes I will seek to illuminate, such as unity, interconnectedness, and the role of information, across these seemingly disparate fields, would therefore not be coincidental. Rather, it would suggest the existence of a common, underlying reality that we are attempting to describe with different languages and conceptual tools. The interdisciplinary nature of this investigation is, therefore, a deliberate reflection of the hypothetical, multidimensional nature of consciousness itself. We now turn to the theoretical foundations for the hypothesis of a universal information field, viewed from the perspective of quantum physics and cosmology. My search for a theoretical basis for understanding consciousness as a potentially non-local phenomenon, one linked to a universal information field, naturally began with quantum physics, the discipline that first challenged the classical mechanistic worldview. We will start with quantum phenomena and their role in bridging mind and matter. Quantum mechanics, QM, fundamentally changed our understanding of reality. One of its most intriguing aspects is the observer effect, which shows that the very act of measurement can influence the state of a quantum system, thereby challenging the concept of a purely objective reality that exists independent of an observer. This phenomenon suggests that the boundary between the cognizing subject and the cognized object is not as sharp as classical physics had assumed. Another key discovery is quantum entanglement, which Albert Einstein termed spooky action at a distance. It reveals that two or more particles can be linked in such a way that their states remain instantaneously correlated, regardless of the distance separating them. This means that a measurement performed on one particle instantly determines the state of the other, even if they are on opposite ends of the galaxy. This points to a profound non-locality in the universe, where systems are not entirely defined by their local properties, but are instead part of a larger, interconnected whole. These fundamental quantum principles, the observer effect, entanglement, and non-locality, provide a scientifically grounded foundation for considering the non-local connections and interactions that may underlie field-based models of consciousness and the concept of a universal information matrix. It was these phenomena that first planted in me, as a quantum physicist, the seeds of doubt regarding a purely materialistic, local, and reductionist worldview, compelling me to search for deeper connections between mind and matter. Mention should also be made of the Advanced Observership Model, AOM, which goes a step further, postulating that reality is inherently observer-dependent. It suggests that classical information and our perceived reality emerge from the observer's interaction with quantum systems, a view which is consistent with certain currents of philosophical idealism. The next theoretical framework we must consider is the Orch-OR theory of Penrose and Hameroff. Particularly inspiring in the context of my search has been the orchestrated objective reduction, Orch-OR theory, developed by the physicist Sir Roger Penrose and the anesthesiologist Dr. Stuart Hameroff. This theory posits that consciousness, or at least its proto-elements, arises from quantum processes occurring inside neurons, specifically within microtubules, which are protein polymers that form part of the cell's cytoskeleton. According to Orch-OR, quantum superpositions and computations take place in the microtubules, culminating in a spontaneous wave function collapse known as objective reduction, OR. Each such OR event is hypothesized to be a moment of proto-conscious experience. These events are not random, but are orchestrated by synaptic inputs and other neuronal factors, hence the name orchestrated objective reduction. A key and exceptionally compelling aspect of the Orch-OR theory is its direct connection to the fundamental structure of the universe itself. Penrose proposes that objective reduction occurs when quantum superpositions reach a certain objective threshold related to the fundamental geometry of spacetime, as described within the Diocey-Penrose DP scheme. This means that consciousness is not merely an emergent property of complex brain activity, but is intrinsically, ontologically linked to the very fabric of reality, to physics at its most fundamental level. Penrose even suggests that this collapse threshold corresponds to the energy level of 1 graviton, which represents an attempt to connect quantum mechanics with general relativity. The Orch-OR theory, despite its elegance and explanatory potential, has met with serious criticism. The main objection concerns the problem of decoherence, maintaining delicate quantum states in the warm, wet, and noisy environment of the brain. Critics, such as Max Tegmark, have calculated that the decoherence time for quantum superpositions in microtubules would be on the order of femtoseconds, far too short to be relevant to the neuronal processes associated with consciousness. In response, Hameroff and Penrose have presented a series of counter-arguments and potential mechanisms that could protect quantum coherence in microtubules. They point to the possibility of shielding by ordered water molecules inside the microtubules, the role of metabolic energy delivery in sustaining coherence, and even the potential for biological quantum error correction mechanisms. Research into the potential role of biological structures, like microtubules in quantum computation, including topological quantum computation, is still ongoing and may provide new perspectives. While the Orch-OR theory remains controversial and has not been unequivocally confirmed experimentally, it is testable and stimulates interdisciplinary research at the junction of physics, biology, and neuroscience. Recent, large-scale experiments comparing other theories of consciousness, such as integrated information theory, IET, and the global neuronal workspace theory, GNWT, though not directly addressing Orch-OR, demonstrate science's keen interest in the fundamental mechanisms of consciousness and its readiness to test bold hypotheses. The problem of decoherence, while a serious challenge for quantum theories of mind, has simultaneously become an impetus for the intensive search for new mechanisms of protecting quantum coherence in biological systems. Discoveries concerning functional quantum effects in processes like photosynthesis and avian navigation show that nature may have evolved ways to utilize and even protect quantum phenomena. This tension between the problem of decoherence and the search for its solutions is the driving force for the new and fascinating field of quantum biology. It may provide key elements for understanding how a universal information field, if it exists, could interact with biological systems, including the brain. Another intriguing concept that resonates with my search is the consciousness field theory proposed by Dirk K.F. Meijer. He postulates that consciousness does not reside exclusively in the brain, but in a broader holographic structural field, or receptive mental workspace, surrounding the brain, potentially existing in a hidden fourth spatial dimension, beyond the 3 spatial dimensions we perceive, plus time. According to Meijer, this mental field interacts with the brain, transmitting wave information that is crucial for rapid conscious and subconscious information processing. As a mechanism for this ultra-fast information transfer, Meijer proposes quantum wave resonance between the mental field and the brain, involving a resonant wave pattern that extends across both the neurons and the mental field. Furthermore, Meijer suggests a torus, a donut shape, geometry for this mental field, a structure that appears at various scales throughout the universe. This field is believed to gather information from external sources, e.g. the Earth's magnetic field, dark energy, and is implicitly connected to a universal information matrix through a kind of dynamic holographic boundary, likened to a black hole's event horizon. The mind-brain relationship here is therefore non-dual, unified, yet distinct. This concept of a mental field interacting with a universal information matrix is particularly relevant to my own subsequent hypotheses. Parallel to the discoveries in quantum physics, certain cosmological ideas and information theories also provide a framework for thinking about the universe as a system in which information and consciousness may play a fundamental role. We will begin with the physicist David Bohm and his concepts of the implicate and explicate order. Bohm proposed a profoundly original model of reality, consisting of 2 fundamentally different yet interconnected levels: the implicate order and the explicate order. The implicate order is a deeper, enfolded, more fundamental level of reality in which everything is interconnected, and from which the explicate order, the unfolded everyday world we perceive with our senses, emerges. The continuous flow and transformation between these 2 orders is what Bohm called the hollow movement, representing an undivided whole in eternal motion. Within Bohm's theory, consciousness and matter are not fundamentally separate, but are aspects of the same hollow movement. Some interpretations suggest that the hollow movement itself can be understood as a form of universal consciousness, or an all-pervading information field, where each part or fragment contains information about the whole. This radically challenges Cartesian mind-matter dualism and a fragmented perception of the world. Meaning and consciousness are therefore an integral part of this foundational, dynamic whole. It is also worth mentioning the ontological status of the wave function in Bohmian mechanics, also known as the de Broglie-Bohm theory. In this interpretation, the wave function is not merely a mathematical description of our knowledge of a system, but represents a real physical field, a so-called pilot wave, or quantum potential, that guides the motion of particles. This concept of an information field, actively shaping the behavior of matter, strongly resonates with my search for a universal information matrix. Building on a similar theme of an information-rich universe, philosopher of science Ervin László introduces a concept that asks us to reconsider the very nature of reality itself. What if the universe had a memory? And what if that memory was also its guide? This is the profound territory explored by László. Drawing inspiration from the Vedic term for primordial space or ether, he proposes the Akasha field, or A field, as a fundamental information field that essentially constitutes the substance of the cosmos. László identifies this A field with the physically real quantum vacuum, or zero-point field, that is, the baseline energy and information inherent in seemingly empty space. He proposes it as a kind of holographic matrix that not only records everything that has ever happened in the universe, but also actively informs and shapes its evolution. In this view, the cosmos is not a silent stage for random events, but a dynamic, self-organizing, and self-referencing system. But what could such a field explain? Why are the fundamental laws of our universe so exquisitely calibrated for life? Is it cosmic coincidence, or something more? According to László, the A field may explain this so-called fine-tuning of the universe's physical constants, which makes the existence of life and consciousness possible, suggesting that evolution is an informed process, not a purely random one. This is a direct challenge to the neo-Darwinian synthesis, proposing a cosmos with inherent directionality. This all-pervading information field is also proposed as an explanation for quantum paradoxes, such as non-locality and entanglement, and is, according to László, intrinsically linked to consciousness. Information in this model is not just descriptive, it is prescriptive, it is causal. The concept of an informed universe, in which information plays an active, constitutive role, is key here, and represents an important piece of the mosaic I am endeavoring to assemble. This idea of information as a constitutive force in the cosmos finds one of its most famous and elegant expressions in the work of physicist John Archibald Wheeler. Wheeler, known for his bold and thought-provoking concepts, formulated the famous doctrine of it from bit. The implication is staggering. At its foundation, reality is not material, but informational. He suggests that all physical things, every it, be it a particle, a force field, or the space-time continuum itself, derive their very existence and meaning from information, from bits. These bits, however, are not just binary code. They are understood as the answers to fundamental yes-no questions, obtained through an act of measurement or query by what he termed an observer-participant. Now, while Wheeler himself was cautious about directly invoking a universal consciousness, his theoretical framework insists that reality is not passively observed, but is actively co-created through the participation of the observer. Meaning, and therefore, in a sense, existence itself, is, in his words, a joint product of all the evidence available to those who communicate. The universe, in other words, only comes to know itself through its participants. This points to a fundamentally informational nature of reality, one with which consciousness, as an active participant, interacts and helps to define. The idea that information underpins physical being is yet another crucial voice supporting the possibility of a universal information field. If reality is fundamentally information, as Wheeler suggested, then how might that information be organized? This question leads us to one of the most powerful and counterintuitive ideas in modern physics, the holographic principle. Originating from research into black hole thermodynamics by Bekenstein and Hawking, and from string theory, the holographic principle suggests, in simple terms, that all the information contained within a certain three-dimensional volume of space can be fully described or encoded by a theory that exists on the two-dimensional boundary of that volume. The implication is profound. The three-dimensional world we experience might be, in a sense, a projection, much like how a two-dimensional holographic film can store all the information of a three-dimensional image. This revolutionary idea in physics has naturally led to profound speculation about a holographic consciousness. According to this view, consciousness itself may possess holographic properties, where the whole is contained in every part. An individual human consciousness is a fragment of, or actively interacts with, a larger, holographically encoded field of universal consciousness. Such a model could potentially explain the vast capacity of human memory, as well as non-local phenomena, like out-of-body experiences or intuitive insight. This concept also finds echoes in psychology, the notion of microgenesis, which describes the formation of a mental state as a kind of recapitulation of developmental and evolutionary history, has been linked to the holographic principle, suggesting that brain processes might access universal information via nested holographic surfaces. Now, What is the experimental status of the holographic principle? It remains a subject of intense theoretical research and a quest for observational evidence, especially in the context of quantum gravity and cosmology. So, while direct, unambiguous proof is still being sought, the principle's mathematical consistency and its profound implications for fundamental theory have already secured its place as an essential component of modern theoretical physics. So, where does this leave us? Having journeyed through quantum paradoxes, holographic principles, and theories of an informed universe, we can now attempt a physical synthesis. We can start to redefine the brain's role, not as a generator, but as an interface with a universal information field. The collective implication of the diverse physical and cosmological theories presented above is a potential, and perhaps even necessary, paradigm shift in our understanding of consciousness and its relationship with the brain. Instead of viewing the brain as the sole and exclusive generator of consciousness, we can begin to consider it as a highly advanced transceiver, filter, or amplifier, a biological instrument of extraordinary sophistication, designed not to create the signal, but to tune into, process, and give form to a broader, non-local field of consciousness, or a universal information matrix. The convergence of multiple theories, from the Orch or theory of Penrose and Hameroff, through Meijer's concept of a mental field, to the advanced observership model, around the idea that consciousness is not a passive observer, but an active participant in shaping or selecting aspects of reality, or is intrinsically linked to the fundamental geometry of the universe itself, signals a significant departure from classical, mechanistic views. It suggests a universe in which mind and cosmos are deeply, inextricably interwoven. The recurring motif within these diverse theoretical frameworks is that of information as a fundamental component of reality, be it in the form of Wheeler's it from bit, László's Akasha field, Bohm's implicate order, the holographic principle, or the non-local information field, postulated by Lipa. This points toward the possibility of what might be called an informational ontology. In such a view, consciousness and physical reality are not two separate substances, but are profoundly entangled at the most fundamental level, the level of information, its processing, and its exchange. The universal matrix I have mentioned could be precisely this infinitely complex dynamic information field. These varied physical theories, despite their different starting points and proposed mechanisms, seem to converge on the idea that information is not merely a passive byproduct of matter-energy interactions, but may be a fundamental or even primary constituent of reality. Quantum mechanics, through the observer effect and entanglement, suggests that information obtained in the act of measurement plays a key role in defining a physical system's state. The Orch-OR theory situates proto-conscious moments within the very geometry of space-time, which itself may be a carrier of fundamental information. Dirk Meijer's concept posits a mental field that actively exchanges information with a universal matrix. David Bohm's implicate order is, in essence, an enfolded, holistic information structure from which our perceived world emerges. Ervin László speaks directly of the Akasha field as a universal information field, serving as both the memory and the matrix of the cosmos. John Wheeler's famous maxim, it from bit, places information, the bit, as the very source of physical being, the it. Finally, the holographic principle suggests that our three-dimensional reality may be a projection of information encoded on a two-dimensional surface. This multi-threaded convergence, arising from different and often independently developed lines of physical inquiry, strongly suggests that information may be the key to a deeper description of reality, an essential foundation for my hypothesis of a universal information field. Furthermore, models like the AOM, Wheeler's participatory universe, and even certain implications of the Orch-OR and Meijer concepts suggest that the brain, and its associated consciousness, is not just a passive receiver of information from an external objective world. Rather, it may actively participate in the process of manifesting or interpreting reality from the level of this fundamental information field. This shifts the role of the brain from the exclusive generator of consciousness to a co-creator of experience or a specialized interface with this field. If information is fundamental and consciousness is inextricably linked to it, then the brain becomes a tool for accessing, interpreting, and potentially influencing this information field. This opens the possibility that the content of our consciousness is not entirely generated de novo by neuronal processes, but is at least partially drawn from or shaped by a dynamic interaction with this broader, universal field. This perspective is crucial for understanding my subsequent hypotheses. The following table summarizes the key aspects of the theories we've discussed, highlighting their contributions to the concept of non-local consciousness and a universal information matrix. For me, as someone attempting to build a new, integrated model, this systematization was incredibly helpful in identifying points of convergence and divergence, as well as in grasping the common threads, such as the fundamental role of information, the field-like nature of reality, and observer dependency. I hope this summary will also help you to synthesize this complex landscape of thought, which is essential for activating new neural connections and preparing the ground for our further considerations. Let's pause on this table for a moment. Instead of looking at each theory individually, let's trace the powerful themes that emerge when we look across them. First, notice the proposed location of these processes. For Penrose and Hameroff, the action is deep within the neuron, in the quantum realm of microtubules. For Meijer, it expands outward, into a holographic field in a higher spatial dimension. For Bohm, it is everywhere at once, in the enfolded, implicate order. We see a spectrum of ideas, from the microscopic to the cosmological. Now, look at how each theory proposes a connection to a universal substrate. Whether it's the very geometry of space-time in Orch OR, László's Akasha field acting as a cosmic memory, or the participatory universe of Wheeler, the conclusion points in the same direction. The individual mind is not isolated. It is plugged into something vast and fundamental, and this leads us to the final crucial implication for non-locality. For proponents of the holographic principle, information is inherently non-local and enfolded. In Bohm's model, all of reality is an undivided whole. The consistent thread running through every row is a radical break from classical thinking, suggesting that consciousness is not strictly confined by the familiar rules of space and time. This convergence of ideas, this intellectual scaffolding we've just visualized, is the essential launchpad for the hypotheses we will explore next. In my search for further traces of a universal information matrix, I turned to fields that, while operating in a different language than physics, have long explored the deep, transpersonal dimensions of the human psyche and experience. The depth psychology of Carl Gustav Jung, as well as various mystical traditions and non-dual philosophies, offer a wealth of concepts that resonate in surprising ways with the ideas emerging from quantum physics and cosmology. The work of Carl Gustav Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, represents a particularly valuable source of inspiration for me, especially his concepts of the collective unconscious, archetypes, and synchronicity. Let us begin with his foundational concept, the collective unconscious. Jung proposed the existence of a collective unconscious as a deeper, transpersonal layer of the psyche, distinct from the Freudian personal unconscious, which contains repressed individual content. The collective unconscious is, according to Jung, a reservoir of latent memory traces, instincts, and predispositions inherited from our human and pre-human ancestors, common to all of humanity. It is not merely cultural memory. For Jung, it is a biological, psychic inheritance. It contains the fundamental patterns of experience and reaction, which he famously named archetypes. In the context of my search, Jung's collective unconscious can be interpreted as a kind of non-local information field, or a shared psychic reservoir to which individuals have potential access. And it is here that the language of psychology begins to echo the language of physics in a most remarkable way. Some contemporary interpretations draw parallels between this concept and quantum holography, suggesting that the collective unconscious may reflect the holographic principle, where each individual psyche, like a fragment of a hologram, stores information about the entirety of human experience. In some physical models, the quantum vacuum, as a potential source of everything, is even seen as analogous to this Jungian concept. And emerging from this collective unconscious are its fundamental structures, the archetypes, which function as universal patterns. According to Jung, archetypes, such as the hero, the shadow, the anima and animus, the sage, the great mother, and the self, are the fundamental, universal, and primordial images, the very patterns of thought, behavior, and experience that emanate from the collective unconscious. Their manifestations are ubiquitous, appearing in the myths, dreams, symbols, works of art, and cultural narratives of all societies throughout every historical era. In my interpretation, these archetypes can be conceptualized as fundamental organizing principles or resonant patterns within the hypothetical universal information matrix. Crucially, they are not static images or mere ideas. They are dynamic potentials that actively structure human perception, our interpretation of reality, and our interaction with the world. It is conceivable they function as attractors within this information field, toward which individual and collective experiences naturally gravitate. Beyond the static patterns of archetypes, Jung also proposed a dynamic principle connecting the inner world of the psyche to the outer world of events. Synchronicity, the principle of meaningful acausal connections. Jung coined the term synchronicity to describe a meaningful coincidence between an individual's internal psychic state, such as a dream, a thought, a premonition, or an intense feeling, and an external, objective physical event, where there is no discernible, direct cause and effect relationship in the classical sense. Nevertheless, the very connection between the two events appears deeply significant and is imbued with meaning for the individual. The concept of synchronicity is inextricably linked to Jung's idea of the unus mundus, or one world. This is his postulated, underlying, unified reality in which psyche, mind, and physis, matter, are not fundamentally separate, but are two aspects of the same, single, transcendent reality. The unus mundus can be seen as a philosophical precursor or a psychological equivalent to the concept of a universal information matrix, where the psychic and physical planes are interwoven. Synchronistic events, therefore, may represent moments when the individual psyche resonates with, or briefly accesses, patterns of information from this deeper, unified layer of reality, revealing the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. My own Gnostic experiences, which I mentioned earlier, often had a synchronistic character, reinforcing my sense of a deeper, hidden order. In this context, it is worth mentioning the fascinating correspondence and collaboration between Jung and the eminent quantum physicist and Nobel laureate Wolfgang Pauli. Their years-long dialogue, documented in numerous letters, was a search for bridges between physics and depth psychology. They focused particularly on the nature of reality, the role of the observer, the significance of symbols and archetypes in the formation of scientific theories, and most importantly, the concept of synchronicity as an acausal ordering principle. Pauli, struggling with personal crises, turned to Jung for help, and the analysis of his dreams, rich with archetypal imagery, became a source of profound insight for both thinkers into the parallelism between psychic processes and quantum phenomena. Their work together resulted in a joint publication, in which Jung presented his theory of synchronicity, and Pauli contributed an essay on the influence of archetypal ideas on the writings of Kepler.
For me personally, this dialogue has been a tremendous inspiration to search for similar bridges between my own two fields, physics and medicine, and my own inner experience.
If synchronicity describes moments of connection with a unified reality, Jung's psychology also maps the internal path toward embodying that unity. This is the lifelong process he called individuation, and its culmination in the coincidentia oppositorum. A central concept in Jung's psychology is individuation, a lifelong psychological process of becoming a fully integrated, distinct, and indivisible unity or whole. This process involves the conscious confrontation and integration of various, often opposing, aspects of the personality, including contents of the personal and collective unconscious. Key to this journey is the encounter with and assimilation of the shadow, the repressed, darker, and unaccepted aspects of the self, and the integration of the anima, the archetype of the feminine, in a man's unconscious, or the animus, the archetype of the masculine, in a woman's unconscious. The culmination of the individuation process is the realization of the self, in German, das Selbst, the archetype of fullness, totality, and the center of the psyche, which unites the conscious and the unconscious. The self is characterized by the coincidentia oppositorum, a Latin term meaning coincidence of opposites. This signifies that the self encompasses and unites all contradictory aspects of the psyche, such as conscious and unconscious, good and evil, light and dark, masculine and feminine. Achieving this dynamic integration of opposites leads to a more unified, complete, and authentic state of consciousness, reflecting, at the individual level, the inherent unity of the unus mundus, or the universal matrix. Parallel to Jung's psychological explorations, numerous mystical traditions and non-dual philosophies from around the world have, for millennia, described states of consciousness and concepts of reality that strikingly resonate with the idea of a fundamental unity and a non-local information field. We begin with the insights of ancient Gnosticism, focusing on the Pleroma and the celebrated Logion 22. In ancient Gnostic cosmology, the Pleroma, from the Greek pleroma, for fullness, represents the totality of divine powers and emanations, a perfect unity from which our material cosmos emerged, and which contains the divine sparks trapped within human souls. The pleroma can be interpreted as an ancient, metaphorical conception of a universal consciousness, or a divine information matrix, with which humanity has lost direct contact, but to which it can return through gnosis, direct, intuitive knowledge and knowing. Particularly telling in this context is Logion 22 from the Gospel of Thomas, an apocryphal Gnostic text. Jesus said to them, "When you make the two into one, and when you make the inner like the outer, and the outer like the inner, and the upper like the lower, and when you make male and female into a single one, so that the male will not be male, nor the female be female, then you will enter the kingdom." This is a direct Gnostic instruction on achieving a state of unity by transcending all perceived dualisms. Entering the kingdom is often interpreted as attaining this non-dual unified state of consciousness, a reunification with the pleroma, the divine source. It was this very Logion, due to its profound echo in my own experiences, that became the inspiration for the title of the document I presented to you, which served as the starting point for this series. The Gnostic path involves the marriage of opposing aspects, integrating the fragmented elements of the self and the cosmos, as the means to liberate the inner divine spark and reunite it with the pleroma. This theme of transcending dualism to achieve a state of unity is not unique to Gnosticism. We find a profound parallel in the Christian mystical tradition, particularly in the 14th century teachings of Meister Eckhart on the Unio Mystica and the transcendence of dualism. In the 14th century, the Christian mystic Meister Eckhart described a profound mystical union, the unio mystica, which goes beyond a simple union, unio, of the soul with God, leading to a state of being one with God, or unum esse cum Deo. This signifies an absolute unity in which all distinction between the soul and God, between subject and object, vanishes. Eckhart speaks of the soul's journey to the Godhead, in German, the Gottheit, often described as a desert, an abyss, or an absolute nothingness. This is a state of complete undifferentiation, transcending all attributes and concepts of God, where the soul discovers its true ground in the very ground of the Godhead itself. The experiences described by Eckhart point to the possibility of a connection with a formless universal consciousness, a state of pure being beyond individual identity, which corresponds strongly with the idea of a non-local, field-like consciousness. This mystical understanding of a non-dual reality is not confined to the West. Indeed, we find its most elaborate expressions in the Eastern traditions of Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism, and Taoism. Eastern traditions such as Advaita Vedanta, a school of Hinduism, various schools of Buddhism, especially Mahayana, and Taoism, while incredibly diverse in their doctrines and practices, share a fundamental assumption of non-dualism. Their core thesis posits that ultimate reality is a unified, indivisible whole, called Brahman in Advaita Shunyata, or emptiness, and Buddha nature in Mahayana Buddhism, or the Tao, the way, in Taoism. The perception of a separate, permanent, individual self, or ego, is considered illusory, a concept known as Maya in Advaita, or Anatta, no self, in Buddhism. A key objective in these traditions is to overcome the subject-object dichotomy, which leads to liberation from suffering, or samsara, and to a profound transformation of consciousness. Crucially, these are not merely abstract philosophical doctrines, but practical paths involving meditation, ethical conduct, and the cultivation of wisdom, all aimed at the direct, experiential realization of this non-dual reality. Attempting to synthesize these ancient Eastern insights with modern Western psychology and science brings us to the work of a contemporary thinker, Ken Wilber, and his integral theory, which maps what he calls the spectrum of consciousness. In his integral theory, the contemporary philosopher and thinker Ken Wilber has attempted to synthesize knowledge from diverse fields, science, psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, in order to create a comprehensive map of human development and consciousness. Wilber describes human development as a progression through a spectrum of consciousness, advancing from pre-personal, egocentric stages through personal stages, ethnocentric, world-centric, all the way to transpersonal, spiritual stages. The pinnacle of this spectrum, according to Wilber, is non-dual consciousness, a state in which all dualisms, such as self and other, subject and object, spirit and matter, form and emptiness, are transcended and yet simultaneously included in an integrated direct experience of one taste, or the simple feeling of being. This is the ultimate ground of being, the essence of all preceding stages. Wilber's AQAL model, which stands for all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, all types, provides a comprehensive framework, a map of everything, that integrates these diverse aspects of reality, consciousness, and development into a holistic understanding of unity and interconnectedness. The striking similarities between Jung's psychological constructs, such as the collective unconscious, archetypes, and the unus mundus, and key concepts from such diverse mystical and non-dual traditions, the Gnostic pleroma, Eckhart's Godhead, the Eastern concepts of Brahman, Shunyata, or the Tao, all the way to Wilber's contemporary non-dual ground of being, strongly suggest that these different systems of thought, despite their differences in language and cultural context, are describing or attempting to map the same fundamental, transpersonal dimension of reality and consciousness. Jung's collective unconscious, as a universal inherited psychic layer, finds its echo in mystical descriptions of a universal ground of being or consciousness, such as the pleroma or Brahman. Archetypes, as universal patterns that shape experience, correspond to the symbolic figures, deities, or divine emanations that fulfill similar structural roles in the cosmologies and psychologies of mystical traditions. And Jung's Unus Mundus, which postulates a unified reality underlying both psyche and matter, is an almost direct counterpart to non-dual philosophies that explicitly proclaim the existence of such a single, undifferentiated reality. This convergence implies that deep psychological introspection, as practiced by Jung, and contemplative or mystical practices lead to remarkably similar descriptions of a universal, informational, and conscious substrate of reality. This significantly strengthens the hypothesis of a universal matrix as something experientially accessible and psychologically, and potentially ontologically, fundamental. The universal matrix, therefore, is not a new idea, but a concept with deep historical and cross-cultural roots. Furthermore, both the Gnostic imperative in Logion 22 to make the two one in order to enter the kingdom, that is, to achieve a state of unified consciousness, and Jung's concept of the coincidentia oppositorum as the core of the individuation process and the nature of the self, point to a fundamental dynamic. The integration of perceived dualisms is the key, transformative process for accessing or realizing this non-local, unified consciousness. Logion 22 provides clear instructions for uniting opposites, inner and outer, above and below, male and female, as the path to the kingdom. Jung's process of individuation, a journey to psychological wholeness, culminates in the realization of the self, which by definition is the unification of all psychic opposites. Both Gnosticism and Jungian psychology frame this integration not as a mere intellectual concept, but as a profound, experiential transformation leading to a fundamental shift in consciousness and being. This means that the universal matrix, or non-local consciousness, is not passively perceived, but is actively realized through an inner, integrative process. Our own state of psychological integration thus becomes the key to experiencing this broader, unified consciousness. My own scientific and personal path, being an attempt to integrate physics with medicine and science with inner experience, is an example of this very process. The consistent characterization of non-dual consciousness across diverse traditions, from Eastern philosophies like Advaita and Buddhism to Western mysticism like Eckhart, and contemporary integral theory like Wilber, as an experiential state that transcends conceptual thought, marked by unity and the dissolution of the separate self, points to a fundamental human capacity to perceive reality in a non-localized, field-like, and unified way. Advaita Vedanta describes the realization that Atman, the individual self, is Brahman, ultimate reality. Mahayana Buddhism speaks of realizing shunyata, emptiness, and anatta, no self, leading to an understanding of the interconnectedness of all phenomena. Eckhart describes the soul as one with God, in the desert of the Godhead, a state of absolute undifferentiation. Wilber characterizes non-dual consciousness as the simple feeling of being, the ultimate ground that transcends and includes all dualisms. Despite different cultural expressions and philosophical terminologies, the underlying experiential quality being described is remarkably consistent: the transcendence of ordinary, dualistic perception in favor of a state of undifferentiated unity and interconnectedness. This suggests that the universal information matrix or consciousness is not merely a theoretical construct, but an experiential dimension of reality, and that these traditions offer various maps and methodologies for its direct realization. What this comparative perspective reveals is a striking pattern: a transhistorical and cross-cultural persistence of non-dual philosophy. This convergence of thought strengthens the idea that the experience of non-duality is not a cultural artifact, but a fundamental and universal aspect of human potential. Beyond theoretical frameworks and philosophical psychological concepts, there is also empirical data. While often controversial and requiring further research, this data provides intriguing clues for the possibility of a non-local consciousness, one capable of functioning beyond the confines of the physical brain and accessing information in ways that transcend known sensory channels. Of particular importance in this context are studies on near-death experiences, NDEs, and explorations of altered states of consciousness, such as holotropic states. Let's begin with near-death experiences. Do they offer us windows to a world beyond the brain? Near-death experiences, or NDEs, are complex subjective states reported by individuals who have been close to death or clinically dead and were subsequently resuscitated. The phenomenology of NDEs is rich and often includes elements that are difficult to explain within conventional neurophysiological models. We will focus on one of their most striking aspects: verifiable out-of-body experiences, or OBEs. An out-of-body experience is one of the most remarkable features of an NDE, during which individuals claim to have perceived their surroundings, including their own physical body, from a vantage point outside of it. This often occurs during periods of clinical death, such as cardiac arrest or deep unconsciousness, when conventional brain functions, like cortical activity measured by an EEG, are severely impaired or undetectable. Studies conducted by physicians and psychologists such as Michael Sabom, Penny Sartori, Janice Holden, Bruce Grayson, Pim van Lommel, and Sam Parnia have documented numerous cases in which individuals undergoing NDEs accurately described details of their resuscitation or events unfolding in their immediate vicinity, and sometimes even in distant locations, which they could not have perceived through normal sensory channels. It was precisely this verifiable nature of my own father's account, describing with medical precision details of a surgical procedure he had no right, as a layman, to know, that was so fundamentally jarring for me, and became one of the primary catalysts for my search. In the scientific literature, one can find specific, verified examples of such perceptions. For instance, a patient after cardiac arrest accurately described the unusual behavior of a cardiothoracic surgeon during the operation, flapping his arms as if trying to fly, a peculiar detail later confirmed by the surgeon himself. Another significant category of reports comes from individuals blind from birth who report visual perceptions during their NDEs, describing colors, shapes, or scenes they could have never experienced before. A review by Dr. Janice Holden found that out of 89 analyzed reports of OBEs during NDEs, a full 92% were completely accurate, with another 6% containing minor errors. A large study by the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, NDERF, found that 97.6% of 287 OBE accounts were entirely realistic. Of key importance in this field are the prospective awareness during resuscitation studies, led by Dr. Sam Parnia, aimed at systematically investigating consciousness during cardiac arrest and CPR. In the first AWARE study, published in 2014, out of 2,060 patients who suffered cardiac arrest, 101 of those who survived and could be interviewed completed detailed questionnaires. It was found that 46% had memories from the period of clinical death, with 9% experiencing a classic NDE and 2% describing full awareness consistent with an OBE, with explicit recall of seeing and hearing real events related to their resuscitation. One of these cases was verified and precisely timed using auditory stimuli placed in the operating room. The patient was able to accurately recall a sequence of sounds played during a 3-minute period when he had no heartbeat. Dr. Parnia concluded that consciousness and awareness appeared to occur during a period when brain function should not have been possible, as the brain typically ceases functioning within 20-30 seconds of the heart stopping. The results of the AWARE-2 study, published in 2023 after being presented in 2022, included 567 patients who had an in-hospital cardiac arrest, of whom 53 survived and could be examined. Of these, 28 provided detailed interviews.
It was found that 11 patients, 39%, had a perception of awareness without explicit recall of details. 6 patients, 21%, had experiences consistent with the definition of an NDE, termed AREDS, recalled experiences of death, by Parnia, and 1 patient, 2% of the 53 survivors, corresponding to about 4% of the interviewed group, recalled explicit auditory and visual awareness. In what is a crucial development, the AWARE-2 study was the first to systematically monitor brain activity via EEG and brain oxygenation during CPR. In some patients, even up to an hour after CPR began, EEG signatures such as gamma, delta, theta, alpha, and beta waves, normally associated with consciousness and higher cognitive functions like memory recall, were observed. Parnia and his team suggest these findings may indicate that during clinical death, the brain undergoes a process of disinhibition, the removal of natural braking systems, which could lead to the activation of normally dormant circuits, and grant access to new dimensions of reality, including a comprehensive life review from a moral perspective. It must be noted, however, that the interpretation of the EEG results from the AWARE-2 study is a subject of scientific debate. Bruce Grayson and other NDE researchers point out that in the published AWARE-2 data, no direct correlation was found between the patient's reported experiences of consciousness, NDE, OBE, and the simultaneous occurrence of these specific EEG patterns. It was noted that only 2 of the 28 interviewed patients had available EEG data, and neither of them was in the group with explicit cognitive recall. The issue of potential motion and electrical artifacts that can interfere with EEG recordings during intense CPR procedures, such as chest compressions and defibrillation, has also been raised. This ongoing scientific discussion is crucial for a proper assessment of the significance of these findings. Regardless of these debates, the very possibility of verifiable perception under conditions where the brain should be inactive poses a fundamental challenge to purely materialistic and neurocentric explanations of consciousness. It suggests that consciousness may, at least in certain circumstances, function independently of a fully operational physical brain.
Beyond verifiable out-of-body experiences, NDEs are also characterized by a series of common cross-cultural themes that may likewise point to the non-local nature of consciousness. First, the experience of cosmic unity, a feeling of profound, all-encompassing unity and interconnectedness with all things, all people, and the entire universe. This is often accompanied by the transcendence of ordinary dualisms, such as self and other, and by moving beyond the normal limits of time and space. Second, universal love and an encounter with light. Frequently reported are overwhelming feelings of unconditional love, deep peace, and an encounter with a being of light, or a mystical radiant light that emanates love, wisdom, and acceptance. Third, a panoramic life review and lasting transformation. Many NDE experiencers undergo a panoramic, often non-linear, review of their life, seeing key events and their impact on themselves and others, frequently from a moral or ethical perspective. These experiences often lead to deep and lasting transformations in their value systems and beliefs, such as reduced materialism, increased spirituality and compassion, and a significantly reduced fear of death, as well as a strengthened sense of meaning and purpose in life. And finally, the theme of consciousness independent of brain function, the very occurrence of clear, highly structured conscious experiences, often described as more real than real, during periods of cardiac arrest, when conventional EEG activity is typically flat within seconds, or deep coma, strongly suggests that consciousness is not solely and entirely dependent on ongoing complex brain activity. This supports the idea that consciousness may, in such moments, access a non-local field or dimension of reality.
Near-death experiences are not the only states that challenge our conventional understanding of the mind. Another area providing significant phenomenological data for my search is the work of Stanislav Grof, a Czech-born psychiatrist and a pioneer of transpersonal psychology,
who has dedicated his life to the exploration of our inner universes. Central to his work is the concept he termed holotropic states of consciousness. Grof coined the term holotropic, literally moving toward wholeness, from the Greek holos, meaning whole, and trepain, to move toward, to describe a broad category of extraordinary states of consciousness. He posits that these states facilitate access to deep layers of the human psyche, including the biographical domain, related to one's life history, the perinatal domain, related to the birth process, and the transpersonal domain, which extends beyond the individual boundaries of the ego and personal history. These states can be induced by various methods, particularly through the technique of holotropic breathwork, developed by Grof and his wife Christina, a method combining accelerated, deeper breathing, evocative music, and focused bodywork in a safe, supportive setting. Historically, they were also induced through the controlled use of psychedelic substances, such as LSD or psilocybin, in a therapeutic context. Based on his observations of thousands of sessions with these non-ordinary states of consciousness, Grof identified a crucial sequence of experiences. He called these the 4 basic perinatal matrices, or BPMs, and saw them not just as memories of birth, but as profound gateways to the transpersonal realm. Grof identified 4 basic perinatal matrices, BPMs, which are dynamic systems of condensed experience, or KOX systems, related to the specific stages of biological birth, but also holding deeper, archetypal, and transpersonal meaning. BPM I, primal union with the mother, the amniotic universe. This corresponds to the experience of the fetus in the womb before the onset of labor. It is characterized by a sense of unity, a lack of boundaries, and oceanic tranquility, but it can also contain elements of anxiety if the intrauterine environment was disturbed. BPM 2, cosmic engulfment, no exit. This corresponds to the first stage of labor, when uterine contractions are compressing the fetus, but the cervix is still closed. It is characterized by a sense of entrapment, hopelessness, immense pressure, and having no way out. On a symbolic level, it can manifest as an experience of hell or cosmic engulfment. BPM 3, the death rebirth, struggle. This corresponds to the second stage of labor, when the cervix is open and the fetus is actively pushing through the birth canal. This is a phase of intense struggle, pain, and aggression, but also of powerful life forces, sadomasochistic and scatological elements, fire, and destruction. On a symbolic level, it is a titanic struggle of death and rebirth. BPM chapter 4, the death rebirth experience, liberation. This corresponds to the third stage of labor, the moment of birth, and the cutting of the umbilical cord. It is characterized by an experience of total annihilation and ego death, followed by liberation, rebirth, an expansion of consciousness, and a connection with light, love, and the spiritual dimension. According to Grof, these matrices are not merely a record of birth trauma, but also serve as powerful gateways to archetypal imagery and the vast realms of the transpersonal unconscious. The full, experiential reliving and integration of the content associated with the BPMs often culminates in a profound psycho-spiritual death and rebirth experience, which Grof considers to be the central mechanism for healing deep-seated psychological trauma and fostering a fundamental transformation of the personality. According to Grof's cartography, once a person traverses the perinatal matrices, the journey often opens up to an even wider territory, the domain of transpersonal experiences, which extends far beyond our individual boundaries. Holotropic states, especially after moving through the perinatal matrices, frequently grant access to a vast range of transpersonal experiences that transcend the limits of the individual ego, time, space, and linear causality. These can include memories of past lives or karmic experiences, identification with other beings, humans, animals, or plants, with all of humanity, with nature, or even with the entire cosmos. Encounters with archetypal figures, deities, and spirit guides from various mythological and religious traditions. Mediumistic experiences, channeling, and extrasensory perception. Journeys to other dimensions of reality and mythological worlds. And experiences of unity with a universal consciousness, with the absolute, or the experience of what Grof calls the supracosmic void. These extraordinary experiences, catalogued in detail by Grof, suggest that individual consciousness can, under certain conditions, transcend its usual limits and access information and experiential realms that go far beyond personal history and the constraints of the physical body. This points to a potential connection with what I call the universal information matrix. Now, while specific neuroimaging studies on holotropic breathwork itself are rare, the broader field of research into non-ordinary states of consciousness, including those induced by meditation, psychedelic substances like DMT and LSD, or other breathing techniques, provides some context. EEG and fMRI studies in these states often show significant changes in brain activity. These include a global reduction in the power of alpha and beta waves, which are associated with normal waking consciousness and sensory filtering, an increase in the power of slower waves, like delta and theta, and faster gamma waves, as well as changes in resting state functional connectivity, for instance between the prefrontal cortex, DLPFC, and other areas, including the visual cortex and the thalamus. These neurophysiological changes often correlate with subjective reports of experiencing unity, the transcendence of time and space, ego dissolution, and mystical experiences. While these mechanisms are still under investigation, they provide clues that profound shifts in consciousness have their neural signatures. This, however, does not preclude the possibility that the brain here is acting more as a modulator or receiver of information from a broader field. But these experiences are not merely a catalog of curiosities. Grof's work emphasizes their profound therapeutic function, particularly in the integration of trauma and dualisms. By enabling the re-experiencing and working through of deep-seated traumas, including those from the perinatal period, holotropic states possess, according to Grof, immense healing and transformational potential. Furthermore, Grof's idea of the universe as a cosmic game, or Lila in the Hindu tradition, in which absolute consciousness explores itself through manifestation in the world of form, polarity, and multiplicity, suggests that the integration of dualisms and opposites is not just a goal of therapy, but part of a larger cosmic dynamic. But these experiences are not merely a catalog of curiosities. Grof's work emphasizes their profound therapeutic function, particularly in the integration of trauma and dualisms. By enabling the re-experiencing and working through of deep-seated traumas, including those from the perinatal period, holotropic states possess, according to Grof, immense healing and transformational potential. Furthermore, Grof's idea of the universe as a cosmic game, or Lila in the Hindu tradition, in which absolute consciousness explores itself through manifestation in the world of form, polarity, and multiplicity, suggests that the integration of dualisms and opposites is not just a goal of therapy, but part of a larger cosmic dynamic. At this point, I wish to return for a moment to my personal Gnostic experiences. I place them in the context of the empirical and theoretical frameworks presented not as proof in itself, but as the personal, phenomenological impetus that gave direction to my scientific search. It was the clarity and depth of these insights, their timeless and spaceless character, as well as the sense of direct contact with the fundamental structure of reality that allowed me to perceive the convergences between subjective experience and objective, albeit often fringe, scientific research. For me, they were a kind of internal confirmation that the path I am on, while unconventional, can lead to a deeper understanding. The consistency of key NDE elements,
such as out-of-body experiences, encounters with a light, a sense of unity, and the life review, as well as the similarity of certain transpersonal experiences in holotropic states across different cultures and individuals, suggests the existence of some universal, accessible, and potentially non-local dimensions of experience, or fields of consciousness, rather than just idiosyncratic hallucinations or culturally conditioned fantasies. If these experiences were solely the product of individual brain pathology, such consistency and universality would be difficult to explain. It indicates, rather, that these states may provide insight into certain fundamental structures of reality or consciousness that are common to humanity, which strongly resonates with the concept of a universal information field. The results of the AWARE studies, indicating the possibility of retaining certain forms of consciousness and complex, lucid experiences with minimal or undetectable, by conventional methods, cortical activity, and even the detection of EEG signatures associated with higher cognitive functions during CPR, pose a serious challenge to simple neurocentric models. The standard model posits that complex consciousness requires complex integrated neuronal activity, especially in the cerebral cortex, which ceases shortly after cardiac arrest. However, NDE accounts, including verifiable OBEs and the EEG data from the AWARE studies, despite the ongoing debate over their interpretation, undermine the dogmatic assertion that consciousness is impossible without typical brain activity. This forces the serious consideration of models in which the brain may function as a receiver or modulator of a broader field of consciousness or information, not its exclusive generator. Finally, the profound and lasting changes in worldview, value systems, and sense of life's purpose, reported both by NDE experiencers and by those undergoing transformative processes in holotropic states, suggest that these are not merely epiphenomenal hallucinations or fleeting fantasies. If these experiences were purely subjective illusions with no reference to reality, it would be difficult to explain such consistent, often positive, and deep transformations. The transformative power of these experiences suggests they touch upon something fundamental in the human psyche and its relationship with reality. This may mean that accessing these non-local, unified states of consciousness allows for contact with an information or a dimension that has a real potential to reorganize one's understanding of self and the world, which supports the idea of a meaningful, information-based field underlying reality. The threads presented thus far, from quantum physics and cosmology, from depth psychology, from mystical traditions, and from research into boundary experiences, though they originate from different domains and use different languages, seem to converge toward a common, albeit still speculative, picture. It is a picture in which consciousness is not merely an isolated byproduct of neuronal activity, but a phenomenon of a potentially non-local, field-like nature, fundamentally linked to a universal information matrix. Quantum theories, through concepts like non-locality, entanglement, the observer effect, and more elaborate models like the Orch OR, theory of Penrose and Hameroff or Meijer's field theory, provide the physical and informational basis for considering consciousness as a phenomenon that transcends classical, local frameworks. The cosmological visions of Bohm, László, or Wheeler further strengthen the idea of the universe as a dynamic, informational continuum in which consciousness plays an active, perhaps even a constitutive, role. These perspectives find striking resonances in the depth psychology of Jung, with his concepts of the collective unconscious, archetypes, and the unus mundus, which offer phenomenological and structural models of how an individual consciousness might connect with and interact with this universal transpersonal matrix. Mystical and non-dual traditions, from Gnosticism and the Mysticism of Eckhart to Eastern philosophies and Wilber's contemporary integral theory, have for centuries described the experiential and soteriological paths to realizing this fundamental interconnectedness and unified consciousness, often emphasizing the necessity of transcending dualism. Finally, the empirical data from NDE research, especially verifiable OBEs,
and the transformative effects of holotropic states provide provocative, though still developing, evidence that such non-local states of consciousness and connections with a broader reality are possible and have a profound impact on the experiencer. The consistent appearance of the concepts of field and information as central metaphors and theoretical constructs in such diverse domains as quantum physics, cosmology, and certain psychological and spiritual models suggests a powerful, underlying conceptual convergence. This means that the universal matrix I speak of may be best understood not as a static place or a passive data repository, but as a dynamic, self-organizing information field with which consciousness is inextricably entangled and perhaps even coextensive with it. Quantum physics indicates that quantum fields are fundamental. The observer effect and entanglement suggest an informational interconnectedness. Meijer explicitly proposes the existence of a mental field interacting with the brain. Lipa postulates a fundamental information field as the basis of reality. Cosmology, through Bohm's holomovement, László's A field, and the holographic principle, also points to an information-rich, interconnected universe. Psychology, through Jung's collective unconscious as an information field, also fits this pattern. The recurrence of these key concepts in such different domains suggests they are robust descriptors of this underlying reality. Therefore, the universal matrix is likely not a passive database, but an active, generative field, and consciousness is our interface with that field, or perhaps an inherent aspect of it.
Based on this broad synthesis, I can now venture a preliminary, multifaceted definition of the nature of the universal information matrix or consciousness, a definition that will be further developed and specified in my own hypotheses in the subsequent parts of this series. This matrix is fundamentally informational. It stores, processes, and transmits information, which can be understood not just as data, but as a factor that actively shapes reality, that is, to inform it, is field-like and non-local. It is not limited spatially or temporally in the classical Newtonian sense. Its influences can manifest instantaneously over any distance and potentially outside of linear time. Possesses proto-conscious or conscious properties. It is not merely a passive data repository, but may possess some degree of inherent foundational consciousness, or at least the potential for consciousness to emerge from it. Contains universal patterns or structures, such as the laws of nature, physical constants, and on a psychological level, the archetypes that organize experience. Is experientially accessible. Through non-ordinary states of consciousness, such as NDEs, deep mystical experiences, holotropic states, or my own Gnostic experiences, an individual consciousness can gain direct insight into or resonate with this field. My wish, expressed at the beginning of this journey, is for this discourse to activate new neural connections within you, my readers and fellow scientists. I believe that the integrated view I am attempting to present, even if it remains speculative in many aspects, can lead to a fundamental shift in perspective, a reevaluation of the self, a shift from perceiving oneself as an isolated, brain-bound ego to understanding the self as an interconnected, field-like phenomenon that participates in a larger cosmic consciousness. A new understanding of reality, perceiving reality not as a collection of separate, independent objects, but as an undivided, dynamic, information-rich whole that is potentially co-created, or at least profoundly shaped, by our conscious interaction with it. Our place in the cosmos. Recognizing humanity not as an accidental product of blind evolution in an indifferent universe, but as an integral part of a conscious, evolving cosmos, with an inherent potential to access deeper levels of information, meaning, and experience. The process of making the two one, as described in Logion 22 of the Gospel of Thomas, or of achieving the coincidentia oppositorum in Jung's psychology, can be reinterpreted in light of modern field theories as a fundamental shift in conscious attention. It is a shift from the everyday
dominant, localized, particle-like mode of perception, focused on discrete objects, distinctions, and dualisms like subject-object, self-world, mind-matter, to a delocalized, wave-like mode of perception. In this latter mode, the direct experience of the underlying unity, interconnectedness, and field-like nature of reality becomes possible. Quantum physics describes a fundamental particle-wave duality. Field theories emphasize the wave-like, distributed nature of fundamental reality. If consciousness itself possesses, as I suggest, field-like properties, then our daily experience of dualism and separation may correspond to a collapsed or localized state of this consciousness field, focused and processed by our brain structures. Mystical, meditative, or psychological practices aimed at unifying opposites and transcending the ego could then be seen as methods of defocusing this imposed localization, allowing consciousness to experience its more fundamental, non-local, wave-like nature, to enter into a more direct resonance with the universal matrix. My own Gnostic experiences were characterized by precisely this sense of dissolving boundaries, the vanishing of dualisms, and a direct insight into unity, which can be interpreted as a momentary shift into this wave-like mode of perception. This suggests a potential mechanism for how one might connect with the universal matrix, going beyond the mere statement that such a connection is possible. The synthesis of these diverse domains, physics, cosmology, psychology, and mysticism, suggests something even more profound. Consciousness is not merely in the universe, nor is the universe simply a passive backdrop for consciousness. Rather, consciousness and the universe, specifically its fundamental informational architecture, are co-arising, co-evolving, and mutually implicating aspects of one single, underlying process or reality. One might recall Bohm's hollow movement, or Grof's cosmic game here. Quantum theories like Orch or Penrose's more general ideas link consciousness to the fundamental geometry of space-time. Informational cosmologies from Wheeler or László see information as fundamental to physical reality itself. Psychological and mystical views often describe a deep identity or an inseparable interconnectedness between individual consciousness and the universal ground of being, be it Jung's Unus Mundus, Eckhart's Godhead, or the Brahman of Advaita Vedanta. All of this points away from a simple model of interaction, consciousness plus a separate universe, and toward a model of fundamental entanglement, or even identity. In such a view, the universal information matrix or consciousness is not something external with which an individual consciousness connects, but is rather the greater reality of which individual consciousness is a localized expression, a node in the network, or a fractal iteration. This is a deep shift from a dualistic to a truly non-dual understanding, which I hope resonates with the desire for new neural connections. And so, we reach the conclusion of this second episode in our intellectual journey, a moment to summarize the foundations we have laid, and to open the door to new perspectives. This episode was intended to present the broad spectrum of theoretical and empirical foundations that have shaped my thinking about the nature of consciousness and its relationship with the fundamental structure of reality. I have sought to weave a tapestry from seemingly disparate threads, showing how convergent themes emerge from quantum physics, cosmology, depth psychology, mystical traditions, and research into boundary experiences. To summarize, I have argued that quantum theories, through phenomena such as non-locality, entanglement, the observer effect, and more elaborate models like Orch, Meijer's field concept, or the AOM, indicate that consciousness may not be merely a byproduct of neuronal activity, but an inherent feature of the universe, linked to its fundamental structure and informational processes. The cosmological models of Bohm, László, and Wheeler further strengthen the idea of the universe as a dynamic, informational continuum in which consciousness plays an active, perhaps even a constitutive role. These perspectives find striking resonances in the depth psychology of Jung, with his concepts of the collective unconscious, archetypes, and the unus mundus, and in the transpersonal psychology of Grof, which, through the study of holotropic states, reveals access to vast, trans-individual domains of experience. Mystical traditions and non-dual philosophies, from Gnosticism and the Mysticism of Eckhart to the Eastern systems of Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism, have for centuries described the paths to the direct experience of this unity and the transcendence of the illusion of the separate self. And finally, the empirical data from research into near-death experiences, NDEs, particularly verifiable out-of-body experiences, OBEs, and the aware study results, along with the transformative effects of holotropic states, provide provocative, though still developing, evidence that consciousness can function independently of a fully operational brain and access information beyond known sensory channels. All of these lines of evidence and theory support the concept of consciousness as a potentially non-local, field-like phenomenon, fundamentally connected to a universal information matrix, or consciousness. The theoretical foundations presented in this episode are not an end in themselves. They constitute the necessary preparation, the intellectual scaffolding upon which I will now, in the next parts of this series, begin to construct my own hypotheses. We will move from this broad synthesis to specific, testable models that seek to explain how this all might work. I invite you to subscribe and join me for that next step on our journey. In the meantime, I would be fascinated to read your thoughts and reflections on the ideas we've discussed today in the comments below. Thank you for your time and your attention.